This is episode 11 of the Futures Intelligent Leadership Flowcast with Dr. James Giordano and Gabriele Fernandez-Bueno. Welcome to the Futures Intelligent Leadership Flowcast. This is your host, Tyler Mongan. I am the president of Haku Global. This is a space for globally minded experts to dialogue about the future of leadership with a focus on the key question, how can leadership be more intelligent about futures? From this conversation, innovative wisdom, practical tools, and actionable insights emerge to help future-ready leaders thrive in an uncertain, complex, and exponentially changing world. Let's jump in to the dialogue. Aloha and welcome to this episode of the Futures Intelligent Leadership Flowcast. Really excited to share this episode with you because I'm joined by two scientists and I'm reminded of my early days in college researching parasitic protozoa and DNA binding behaviors within different contexts. And what is interesting is the two guests are many years apart. We have Dr. Jim Giordano, who is well into his career as a professor and neuroscientist, and we have Gabe Fernandez-Bueno, who is just starting his career as a clinical research scientist. So we have perspectives on leadership not only from the mind of scientists, but also from the perspective of different generations. I think you'll find the dialogue very insightful, and I hope it provides you with a new lens for understanding what it means to be a leader. Dr. Jim Giordano is a neuroscientist and neuroethicist focusing upon mechanisms and treatment of neuropsychiatric spectrum disorders and neuroethical issues generated by brain science and its applications in medicine, public life, and military intelligence and warfare. He is a professor in the Department of Neurology and Biochemistry and a chief of the Neuroethics Studies program at Georgetown University. Gabe Fernandez-Bueno is currently a clinical research scientist at the Translational Research Institute for Metabolism and Diabetes. He is a multidisciplinary scientist with an interest in aiding the advancement of medicine to understand the intricate cellular mechanisms at play during metabolic and autoimmune disease pathogenesis. His focus is on creating the next generation of prevention techniques, therapeutic modalities, health services, and medical devices. One thing I really enjoyed in the dialogue was Jim's and Gabe's continual reference to philosophical thought. It helps remind us that philosophical thought is often at the root of scientific theory and research. In the dialogue, we discussed the cognitive basis of leadership, participatory leadership and how that also correlates with human cell biology, the importance of three vistas of capability in the future, how an embodied and embedded brain impacts decision making, why the OODA loop is really the DAC loop, how our biology is expressed through relationships and responds through psychology, why mitochondria is important for understanding leadership function and biological energetics, why understanding causation and disposition are required to complete the story of science, and finally, how initial conditions shape a system and how that impacts the context of leadership. Let's listen. Aloha, Jim and Gabe. Thank you both for joining me today on this episode. And as always, I want to start with this key question of what does it mean for a leader or leadership to be intelligent about the future given uncertainty, complexity, and exponential change? And I'd love for both of you to answer it from your work and your perspective. And I'd like to start with Gabe.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tyler, for having me. And Jim, it's a pleasure to meet you as well. So just to get right into it, right? I think for me personally, what I've seen in my little bit of time on this solid rock, it's that leaders are normally not equipped for the future. And I think most of us would agree that most people in leadership positions maybe just kind of made it there through sheer will and force and determination, but never sort of what I would consider an imaginative boundary to what can be made of their position. And so for me, it's what can leaders do to be better? What can leaders do to be intelligent, as we like to say? And it's really for me as a young person, I think leaders really, really need to start listening to the people that they represent. And I'm going to take a little bit of a snippet of a previous podcast that I had listened to from another person on LinkedIn where he said, when you're a CEO, you don't manage 500 people. 500 people manage you. And I thought that was such an interesting take, because it really shifts the dynamic, right? As CEOs, as leaders, as people in positions of power, they're always driving the car forward, but rarely do they take a look at the passengers that are with them. And so for me, I think for leaders to be ready for the future, to work in this dynamic landscape that's ever changing, especially with the way computational dynamics are going, um, I think that the leaders need to really reach out to their people and say, I don't have an expertise in this area, but let's work together to become experts in that area. Let's develop this area together, and through those meaningful collaborations, we can create, whether it's a new device, a new therapeutic modality, a new organization, a new policy, whatever it may be, that actively benefits everybody, right? And it's this idea that we have to work not just for ourselves, but for one another. And I think leaders need to kind of go back to that a little bit, right? They've all been, so if we think of what leaders are, they were always the people who innovated an industry, who were driving that industry, who were really just the giants, right? Like I guess for me, the one of the biggest ones that comes to mind is Bill Gates, right? While he didn't invent the computer, he certainly took charge of what was available to him at the time and made the most out of it. So now, is Bill Gates a leader? I think, some people would say yes, some people would say no, given all the philanthropic programs he's done. But the most important thing, and I would say the defining point of Bill Gates, has been that as a leader, he's constantly evolving, he's constantly changing, he's constantly upgrading his people around him, his knowledge base, and and himself, right? And I think Jim might even agree with this, is that as humans, we can choose to stay stagnant, right, at a cognitive and physical level, or we can choose to go above and beyond that. And sometimes that requires not just us putting effort into it, but other people helping us get there. So,
Great.
but that's just my take on it.
Thanks, Gabe. That's great. And Jim, from your perspective, how do you answer it?
Excellent points, Gabe. And Tyler, thank
Yeah.
you very much for having me on board.
Yeah.
It's certainly it's wonderful to share the airwaves with both you and Gabe. Gabe brings in a lot of very key points. I mean, the idea of what the leader is, how the leader engages, whether the leader is sensitive and responsive to the fact that leading from the front of the boat also needs a dynamic of understanding what that boat is composed of, not only above the waterline, but below the waterline, so to speak.
Yes.
So, in thinking of what a leader is, and again, I come from a fairly narrow sandbox. I'm a neurocognitive scientist, and so what I'm going to be contributing in that domain is, well, what do we know about leaders and leaderships?
Mm-hmm.
So, if you think of a leader, there's two ways one can lead. There could be an ordinal leader, in other words, the one that went first, or there can be an existential leader or experiential leader, and that's the one who kind of goes best, so to speak. I mean, if I'm the one who goes first, I'm the first guy out the gate, doesn't necessarily mean I'm doing it best. To sustain that leadership and to do that with relative vision and then have people follow you, not only because you're first, but because there's something exemplary and existential about that, very often is dependent upon leadership style. And what we know from the neurocognitive sciences, there were really two types of leaders. One is called an open style of leadership, which is, as Gabe was alluding to, this is the person who is, maybe driving the proverbial bus, but is very sensitive to three things that are the dynamics of what that means. Number one, who's on the bus? Number two, where is the bus going?
Let's go.
And number three, what is the ambiance of that trip, so to speak? So it's not just about the destination, it's about the voyage itself. And then the other is the closed leader. And very often this is the person who says, this is my vision. Everybody needs to get behind me and this is where we're going. If you don't like it, get off the bus. So what you're really seeing there is sort of cognitive styles of one who's sort of a leader via intelligence. There's leaders who are leaders via charisma. There's a positional leader who sort of becomes appointed, and as a consequence, there's a power dynamic there of positional appointment. But then there's the participatory leader, and that's what Gabe was alluding to. And I think more and more, what needs to be important is that contemporary leadership, whether you're looking leadership in military context, commercial context, academic context, political context, but certainly when you're looking at commercial and business context, given the globality, internationality, and multidimensionality of that,
Mhm.
is that the leader today is facing a very, very different set of vistas or horizons
Mm.
of capability than the leader of perhaps even half a generation ago, in part because of the fusion of the technologies that make information ubiquitous, copiously available, and myriad in its applications and
Mm.
its availability. Let me just speak to this for a real quick moment, if
Mhm.
I could. We have what we call, we do sort of future speculation and forecasting. They have three we call vistas of capability. The vista of probability is what happened 5 years to the present and what will happen 5 years in the future. So those things that are
Mm,
proverbially on the drawing board or that are already in the milieu, they're coming to realization now. And the reality is that in 5 years, these things are going to be tangibles. Based upon those probabilities, the vista from 6 years to 15 years in the future is referred to as the vista of possibility. In other words,
Mhm.
realizing certain probabilities makes much more possible certain things that can then vector from there in a somewhat fractal way, depending on what the pushing forces are or the
Mm.
pulling forces. And then you go from the 16 to 30-year point, and that's called the vista of potentiality. And more, what's going to be required, given the ubiquity and copiousness of information that is available to leaders and those they lead, is the view towards that interface between what is possible and what is the potential. Now we're looking 15 to 20, 30 years in the future and appreciating the deductive view, which says, all right, if that's where we want to be, need to be, or in some cases, a combination of both want and need, how do we have to do working backwards to create those necessary ecologies inter and intra institutionally to then inductively make those things happen? So again, it's the cognitive style of leadership that it needs to appreciate, number one, the again myriad information that's now available literally at fingertips, the style of processing necessary to do that, and the fact that the leader is not just leading the herd, so to speak, but this very often is a very technically capable, intelligent, and well-informed group of individuals who are sub-leaders themselves.
Mm.
mm,
That's great. I I guess kind of following up on all this, it seems like there's this at least merging theme of participatory, collaborative, inclusive type leadership. And Gabe, from your perspective, and even bringing in some of the science work you do, like how the body collaborates, how can leaders create those environments or form, organizations that are more together oriented?
Tyler, that's a really great question. And to again, Jim brings up really great points as well in terms of the types of leadership that are available. And one point that he made, right, is these groups of individuals are really sub leaders of themselves, right? If we take each one of these sub leaders and we put them in a separate environment, they could very easily lead teams of their own. But the problem, or maybe not the problem, but the real objective is not to get these people to lead teams on their own, but to be part of a team that is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And the body works in a very similar way, right? I've studied mitochondrial biology for, I don't know, I would say probably the last 6 to 7 years. I've always been very fascinated by this intersection of, can we as humans actually modulate the mitochondria in any sort of way, whether it be through pharmaceutical interventions, nutritional, mechanical, whatever it may be, and actually improve our functionality as humans, as leaders. Um, and what I've seen is that it's a top-down approach, right? So when you go into an office or you go into a lab specifically, I would say, right, there's a hierarchy, right? You have your leader or your so-called PI, your professional
Hmm.
investigator, who's managing the entire lab. You then usually have a lab manager, staff scientist, the postdocs, the graduate students, the undergrads, et cetera, and it goes on and on. Everybody understands that they have a specific role to play in the system, and everybody's contribution is equally as important. Now, obviously, at each level, you've gained a different level of expertise and knowledge that you can apply to the problem in order to troubleshoot through it. I think the same can be applied to what I would consider leadership, right? You come across a problem with your group, or you come across a newfound problem in your company, and you say, okay, how do I tackle this? What are my options in addressing this problem? And so it's really no different than when you're a physician and you're confronted with a patient who has an unknown disease, or a disease whose symptomatology is not what you would have expected. You really have to go to the drawing board and say, okay, how do I challenge this? How do I actually make sure that what I'm seeing is the real disease, and then how can I go ahead and fix it, right? And I've always been very interested that when you have PIs who are very, what I would say, hands-on, right? And by using Mr. Miyagi's words, hands-on versus hands-off, the PIs that are hands-on tend to have greater relationships with their postdocs, their graduate students, and they tend to publish a little bit more effectively. And sometimes the quality of the science tends to be better. When these people, leaders and their sub leaders get together, they can start sharing ideas, right? Once they start sharing ideas, they start sharing philosophies. Once they start sharing philosophies, they start sharing lifestyles, and that's really where it becomes important, right? So if we see that the leader of your company, that the leader of your group is a relatively healthy individual, they take time to listen, they're compassionate, they're, as Jim would say, they're participatory leaders. The group tends to respond in a greater fashion to them than those leaders who are hands off, right? And I think the same can be said for when we try to approach health as human performance, right? So we as leaders, right, we eat every day, and those foods can actually have drastic effects on our ability to lead teams. They can change our moods, they can change our philosophies, they can change the simple way of how we interact with others. And that can have not just short-term dynamics, but long and lasting effects that may potentially harm not just the leader, but the sub leaders and the progress that they're trying to make. So it's very interesting from my perspective, because I would say that if you want a great organization, you want people who are reaching their peak, it really needs to start from the top, and it needs to be something that is what I would consider an open facility, right? Where people, while there is a hierarchy, we can all agree that we're all equals. We're all individual humans who are striving and working towards something greater than ourselves. And it's important to acknowledge the fact that everybody brings something different to the table. And, I think conventional leadership would say, well, we just want the guy who's got the credentials on paper, and let's get him in the room and see what he does, and let's go for it. But I would say that the new methods of leadership would say, hold on, I get this guy has the credentials necessary to be here. But what if we took a look at other candidates? Is somebody else, or are there other people who may do this job in a slightly different manner that may benefit us more long term? Right? And it's a calculated risk you're taking. It really is, because, right, you're taking a risk on the person, you're taking a risk on not just them as a person, but as an employee, as what they're going to contribute to the table. So it becomes a very important process of making sure, okay, we want to find individuals who want to be a part of the collective, and then want the collective to grow in such a way that like I said, it benefits not just them, but the people around.
Jim, so back to you on this. Love to hear a follow-up on that, but also, how does this participatory collaborative style leadership also help with scanning the three vistas?
I think this is, Gabe made some very interesting points, not the least of which is that the leader is engaged, and the best leader is one that is hands-on, the participatory leader. And the ambiance, the overall milieu of that leadership environment can be highly productive in a variety of ways because it's relational. And this gets back to something very fundamental. And if I could, with your permission, I want to sort of exercise my 40 years of being a brain scientist here. Leadership styles reflect the idea that the person who is leading is an embodied brain that is embedded in an environment.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we have to appreciate is sort of what's going on in the leader's head. Now, I don't want to just throw around the neuro prefix in a way that's neologistic, and I certainly don't want to get into neurobabble and neuro nonsense. But if we look at the idea of the dynamics of cognitive loading and cognitive capability of the leader, what we want to say here is the brain is, in fact, an organ of relationality. You know, when I went to school years and years ago, I mean, obviously it was a wooden building. I had to walk through the snow and rub two sticks together to get fire. It was go, but we were considering the brain to be sort of the organ of leadership, so to speak. This was the master organ of the body of any set of organisms, and this was the thing that was kind of at the apex of the hierarchy of all those systems.
Mm.
We don't think that anymore.
Mm.
What we recognize is that the brain and a nervous system is a system of relationality.
Mm.
It is a system that is embedded and embodied within a system, that being the body, that is embedded within its systems, being its environments and its ecology.
Mm.
Therefore, the way we respond to others really is the way our brain responds to those ecologies, both internal and external, that we encounter.
Mm.
That's what leadership is about. Gabe brought up a good point. He talked about top-down dynamics. And very often, you know, when we think of how a brain or a nervous system works, we think, well, that's a very top-down system. Your brain, quote, informs the body, directs the body, etc. And as a consequence, what we're really seeing is the neural system steering. Wrong.
Mm.
What we're really seeing is a reciprocity of effect, where bottom-up information is then relationally parsed into that brain system that then creates a top-down matrix.
Mm-hmm.
I really like what the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio calls the feeling of what happens. In other words, the relationship that exists between experience, internal experience, one's physiology, as Gabe alluded to, everything literally from the cellular all the way up to the social experience, if you will, the metabolic all the way up to the mass effect.
Mm.
And what that then does to our cognitions, those internal and external experiences in relation to our external and internal environment, inclusive of other people, essentially change our brain dynamics, which then feed back onto the way we relate. This is what Damasio refers to as emotion and cognition as the feeling of what happens. This gets back to Gabe's idea of the hands-on leader.
Mm.
Does that hands-on leader have a real perceptual dynamic for the feeling of what's happening in that system in which they're not only leading, but they're embedded, recognizing that those individuals that are in that system also have the same bottom up, top down dynamics and are responsive to the environment of leadership that's created. That's critical to understand
Mm.
because the way brains work, the way leadership engages decisions towards actions, has a lot to do with the old concept of what John Boyd referred to as the OODA loop. In other words, we observe certain things, we orient to those observations.
Mm.
From those orientations, we make decisions, and those decisions guide actions. Boyd was a fighter pilot. What he was trying to do is explain how people can respond quickly in a yank and bang, turn and burn situation.
Mm.
But a lot of the work that has occurred since then, and some of it of my own research, we've been through work with my colleagues, has determined that it's not just an OODA loop, OODA, but on the tail end of that OODA, after decisions and actions come consequences.
Mm.
And those consequences feed back to then create dispositions and biases. So what we're really seeing is not an OODA loop, but a DUDAC or a BUDAC loop, where you have dispositions and biases that literally flavor the way we observe, the way we orient to the past and to the future, to then allow us to cognitively determine what decision options we have and then act on those that we believe are going to have the most beneficial consequences with the highest value.
Mm.
So the leader that is positioning themselves within this framework of what is probable, possible, and potential is essentially basing it out of a number of different things. What did they know from their past to be able to shape their decisions? But more than that,
Mm-hmm.
if they're sensitive and responsive to the fact that they're embedded in a system, then you get a mass effect where the net information that's being contributed by the internality of that system, in other words, those who they're leading, as well as the ecology in which that entirety of the system functions, the effort, the enterprise, its effects, its desirable outcomes, its anticipations and expectation become part of that relational dynamic, bottom up, top down. But the thing that's going to make that work is something that Gabriel alluded to just before, is that if we're looking at this as sort of a metabolic effect, it's not static, it's not linear, it's
Right.
dynamically nonlinear. And it goes back to a very old quote that was actually developed by a fellow named Dr. Wolf in response to gastrointestinal function. And his quote is wonderful. I think it speaks to the idea of the way brains work, and certainly I think might be a nice mantra for leadership. And very simply, it's that fixity of purpose demands flexibility of method and style.
Hmm.
Brilliant words.
Super interesting points. I really love that shift of the UDA to the you said the DUDAC, right? So
DUDAC, BUDAC or DUDAC, biases and dispositions both flavor in, because that sort of predetermines one how observes and orients.
And to add to that, it also determines how you lead, right? If our biases and our decisions orient and help us make actions, then the biases have to come from somewhere. And so my question has always been, where do these biases arise from, right? And are they from a socioeconomic perspective, a cognitive perspective, a metabolic perspective? And I would actually say it's probably all three. That's where our biases come in, which then allow us to undergo the BUDAC or the DUDAC.
Good point. I mean, and this is, I think, really important. Back in the 70s and certainly through the 80s, some of the work of a physician named George Engel, and of course, Gabe, you may understand that Engel's work is not only in medicine, but also in science, describes the human as a biopsychosocial entity. We're clearly biological, but our biologies are expressed in our social milieu, that is, our environments, our ecologies with others, the things we do, how we use resources, and certainly much of that has to do with our economics and our business. But then we respond to that social environment psychologically, and we project our biology onto those environments, inclusive of others, psychologically as well. So you're absolutely right. Those biases are multidimensional and multifactorial, and I think the good leader needs to appreciate that and incorporate that as part of the leadership plan, so that there is that overall ambiance within the dynamic of whatever's being led. In other words, that organization that is responsive not only to top-down leadership, but to bottom-up influence, biasing, and decisions.
Absolutely true.
Yeah, I really like this. I mean, one of the things that when I work with teams is I work a lot on what I'd call like context or state, or we could call it disposition, and doing techniques and practices that first really put them in a highly collaborative state. Because if a lot of times when it comes to a meeting, innovation session, foresight session with an executive team, they typically just kind of jump into the process, but they don't work on the disposition and getting the disposition right for the context. And so I'm curious if you guys could speak to that idea of like kind of setting the context, either through your psychology, cognitive function, or metabolic.
Oh, context is everything. I mean, especially, and I'll just speak from my viewpoint of, or at least just the limited viewpoint of metabolism. Context is everything, right? If you are, let me backtrack. In the sense of, right, we used to think that the organs or the brain was the master organ, right? Jim would say, of course, that's wrong. I would counter that with the mitochondria is the master organelle, right? And not just even organelle, but I could even go and say it's the master organ that presides over everything. And I know it's a very simplistic viewpoint in terms of metabolism to boil it all down to just this tiny little, what we would say, brown colored protein machine, right? Or the thing that makes energy for us. But it's so important, right? In the sense that humans across the board have different types of mitochondrial haplotypes. They express disease and aging in vastly different ways. There are mutations that cause aging in different manners. There are mutations that extend lifespan, some that shorten it. And from a metabolic perspective, I've always been interested in that. It's like, well, how did they develop this? What was the context in which they were able to develop this protection, or they developed this disprotection. And that's, to me, that's always been so important, right? What is the state of this person? What do they live in? Where do they live? How do they live? How do they think they're living? Do they, do they believe that they're living a good life? All of that is so important in terms of metabolism and the context in that sense.
So you're saying that a lot of what you're seeing in your research around mitochondrial function is related a lot to not just diet, but also the lifestyle, their beliefs.
The lifestyle, yeah. And, there's plenty of data out there that would support the notion that leaders who take care of themselves, right, from a diet and physical perspective, tend to be leaders that are a little bit more engaged. Their companies tend to do a little bit better. They tend to be what we millennials, I guess, would call they're in touch, right? They have a bit of savviness about them as to what's going on around them, and they can directly plug into that and plug out of it in order to get different perspectives. And so for me, again, context is everything, and especially in terms of mitochondrial biology and then how it gets related to human performance. Not everybody's going to be the same across the board in terms of mitochondrial function. Even within the body itself, the mitochondria functions differently in different organs. And so it really is always a situation of context.
Jim, you got follow up on that at all?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, let me roll back onto something that Gabe said that I think was really important. He was talking about the idea of protection. And I'm not going to disagree with him at all, because, one of the things we're seeing in the brain sciences is the overall importance of the mitochondria, not just as the powerhouse of the cell, but in very often determining the context in which those cells function. In other words, is the cellular energetics contextually appropriate to the demands that are being placed on it? Well, you can't get a better analogy of leadership than just that. Are the energetics of leadership being contextually appropriate to the demands that are being placed not only upon the leader, but upon those that they lead? Which gets us back to the idea of the mitochondria as being exceedingly a protective organelle for the structure and functional integrity of the cell. And we see that dynamically in the neural systems, not only in nerve cells, but in another group of cells that are highly communicative in nervous systems called glial cells.
Right.
But protection, if we go from the cellular all the way up to the social, in other words, if we're taking these sort of large systemic jumps, and what we're looking at is the analogy, the metaphor, and in some cases a simile of organelles being important to the cell therefore being important to the system being important to the organism, and that's what then determines function. We can almost take a look at this like a body politic, if you will, of where leadership occurs with regard to an echelon, and ultimately what the leader at the top has to contribute based upon their sensitivity, their relative fitness, and therefore the receptivity to those, quote, leaders who are contributing the bottom-up dynamic. And a lot of it is about protection. Let me kind of give you an idea here. The way humans function, and the way almost any organism functions, particularly mammals, is that when we parse a situation, a leadership situation, a choice situation, a decisional situation, we can pretty much bring this down, simplify it into a relatively straightforward equation. In other words, the expected value of whatever result is consequential to our decision and action must be one in which the expected value of the gain is going to be greater than the expected value of the loss. We do this all the time. The light is yellow. Should I run the light or should I stop? Should I take the extra bite of chocolate cake? Should I work late? Should I come in early? And so what we see is that Gabe made a very good point about the altruistic leader. In other words, the leader who is altruistic very often is one who's able to embody certain characteristics and feel good about those characteristics in themselves, and then try to cultivate, if not identical characteristics, but equivalent characteristics in the echelons of leadership. So the altruistic component of leadership is that the leader directs others. But there is, of course, always an egoistic component. In other words, the way I lead and what leadership does for me or to me as the leader is important. But what becomes equally is really not only what does that mean for me in leadership, but good leadership understands, as Gabe and I both alluded to earlier, that quote, followership is also nothing more than sub-leadership. So making individuals feel enabled, empowered, that the decisions and actions that they're committing and that they're contributing to are in some way important in a bottom-up way to overall leadership, which then contributes to the top-down dynamic, if you will, the ambiance of the leadership, quote, culture and what's being led, becomes very, very critical. And again, this is exactly the metaphor for what Gabe was talking about with regard to going from the organelle to the cell, to the cells within a system and an organ. It's leadership, followership with regard to protection, establishing an environment in which there's dynamic energetics that then creates sort of a healthy system that is responsive, flexible, nonlinear, and adaptive.
Very interesting.
Yeah, very well said, Jim.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting also to think about how this plays into, the idea of uncertainty and complexity, and how, leadership is in this environment right now where they feel like the future is more uncertain, and they feel like things are a lot more complex. And I know one of the things that I've been looking at and researching a lot around is this idea of kind of doing away with kind of causal relationship thinking and looking more at dispositional, like we talked about earlier, and looking at more of the relationships and how things emerge within certain dispositions or environments versus things are caused by, and how that plays into complex and uncertainty and within environments. So curious if you guys could speak to that, Gabe.
Yeah. Wow. There's so much to be said about what I would consider the future, right? And you make a great point, Tyler. The uncertainty, the complexity of what is coming is definitely not something that any leader should underestimate. But I also think that the complexity of the problems that we're trying to solve and the problems that we will run into is a result of us having solved the less complex problems, right? So now we're asking much more defined questions. We're asking much more direct questions that don't just try and get at what I would consider a surface level answer, but we want a mechanistic answer. We want to know mechanistically what's going on. Did this protein touch that protein to then cause this cascade, which then caused this expected phenotype and or pathophysiological response? It really is. I mean, I think I could go on for ages about that, but I'll have to just let Jim go on this one.
So you're absolutely right. This is one of those things that if we had 3 hours, I'm sure, and we had an adult beverage, it would be perfect. I mean, a good cup of coffee over a really nice whiskey would make for a great conversation.
Oh, absolutely.
I'll buy first round, you got next. So
Sounds great.
You talk about this idea of needing to understand mechanism. And that's sort of become the predominant theoretical construct of much of post-Enlightenment Western philosophy. I mean, all of it. I mean, whether we're talking about biological philosophy and the philosophy of science or leadership philosophy, how does it work? How do these things work? But you have to confront something here called the mechanistic paradox. Humans are interesting creatures. We really don't believe that something works until we figure out how it works.
Right.
And if we understand mechanism, we're confident, even if we sort of make up stories or explanatory fictions for the mechanism. And as Gabe well knows, there are plenty of things that we were taught in school that they thought they had a handle on, and the nature of science is self-critical and self-revising. And it's like, it was good enough for the time to create sort of a harmless naturalism where we thought that's how it works. But then what really has to happen is we have to appreciate it doesn't work that way. So we revise not only a single fact, but the entirety of the mechanistic process, which gets us back to the idea of the whole context shift. And this is critical because more and more what's happening goes back to the idea of the ubiquity of technology, the pace at which things are occurring. Leaders and leadership type organizations require, I think, more than ever an understanding of complex dynamics. Let me explain what I mean by this. We're talking about systems in systems, and I don't care if those systems are organelles within cells and cells within systems and systems within organs and organs within an organism. We're talking about systems that function in systems, and systems function in a way that is complex and dynamical. That's a real word, dynamical. And there are particular conditions that go along with that. almost every system that has those characteristics, human systems and the systems that humans create, like business, organizations, institutions, enterprises, are always sensitive to their initial conditions.
Mm.
And what happens is from those initial conditions, particular attractors are then formed or occur that draw the system and its behavior in certain directions. This goes back to the idea of biases that have consequences that shape orientations for decisions.
Mm.
Mm.
Then what happens is those conditions, although not initial, become reinitialized. So
Mm.
the system has to be responsive and flexible. And this then is what gives us that level of, again, flexibility that needs to occur if there's going to be fixity of purpose.
Mm.
But more and more, the issue becomes, do we have a grand strategy, so to speak? In other
Mm.
words, are we able to approximate that thing that we desire in that zone of potentiality? Define that as sort of both the worldview and the spirit of the time, the zeitgeist of whatever that organization is, and then say the top-down leadership has to be sensitive to changes in the bottom-up responses, reactions, and efforts to be able to make sure that there is that nonlinear adaptability within the organization to achieve that grand strategic goal. So Gabe's right. The leader of today has to be far more appreciative of complex dynamics within the system that is the enterprise and the system in which that enterprise seeks to achieve its goals, so as to be able to not only manifest grand strategy, but to work tactically and flexibly in an
Mm.
adaptive way based upon the relative health and integrity of the system, their enterprise, their effort, their company that they're looking to maintain.
It's really interesting because as you're talking, I'm also thinking how most leaders really aren't. I mean, and maybe this is just how I see it, but maybe I shouldn't generalize too much. But they're not they're not ready to think like this, or just not trained to think like this.
I would say they're not trained. Yeah.
But I think that's as much that's an opportunity as well as it is a challenge. I think if one of the
Yeah.
things that we're facing is that leadership on the local to global scales have to appreciate all of those scales again in a way that is systemic and systematic.
Mm.
The way we approach what leadership is, clearly through podcasts like this and the effort that it seeks to do, which is both educational as well as in some cases what I would consider to be intellectually entrepreneurial, needs to change the way the leader is trained, recognizing that leaders are made and the leaders
Yes.
need to develop that flexible toolkit so as to
Mm.
be able to say that, everything is not a hammer because everything out there
Mm.
isn't a nail.
Mm-hmm.
But having a utility belt and recognizing as well that that utility belt is not just tools, techniques, and methods, but those methods are the conjoinment of the individuals who are sub-leaders within the echelons of that hierarchy.
Mm.
That's going to be the new dynamic leadership, I think. And I think that this really creates, in some cases, as you say, a challenge.
Mm.
But I think with that challenge comes an opportunity to revise the pedagogical as well as practical ways that leaders are educated and trained.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting.
Absolutely.
I was in medical school in 2004, and one of the things that was difficult for me is I really love to think in systems. I had gone to graduate school in philosophy, and we were taught to think kind of big and see things that don't normally connect and see how they could connect. But in medical school, we were really taught to focus in on the causal relationships and not see as much of the connection between things. And I got really interested in acupuncture because in Oriental medicine because they had a bigger like system approach and integrated approach. Um, and so I think you're hitting on a key point that there needs to be kind of this new way of thinking and seeing the world um, in more of this relational, participatory, highly connected and complex. And it takes I think what we're saying, it takes a whole new way of training.
We like to say, well, it's going to take a new way. It's going to take a new vision. Well, let's bracket that a minute, because I'd like to think that human ingenuity is such that if we look sometimes to the ancients, and
Yeah.
I'm not espousing the fact that we need to take a look at a bunch of old white guys who've been dead for thousands of years, but if we take a look at the approach, for example, of the philosopher Heraclitus,
Mm-hmm.
the idea there is what are the parts and what are the wholes?
Mm-hmm.
What is the balance necessary to strike between appreciating the relationship between the parts and the whole?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we then come to understand the whole, not just as a sum of its parts, but because of the net dynamic relationship that exists between them?
Mm.
Well, that's antiquarian philosophy.
Yeah.
And we certainly see the same thing when we're talking about some of the phenomenological philosophies that represent the idea of understanding the whole by virtue of an appreciation of the contextual relationality of its parts,
Mm.
which gets us back to the entirety of how we approach systems in medicine or how we approach systems in business or in enterprise.
Mm.
There's still that nonlinear dynamic that needs to be taken into accord. And I think that ultimately that's going to be the challenge
Mm.
for the way to educate leaders and those who look to lead. And I think the educational system for leadership.
No, I like that.
Yeah.
It's always good to go back and remember that a lot of this stuff has been talked about, thought about before. It's already part of our history as humans, and we just need to look to that and see what's there. And Gabe, do you have any follow-ups on this?
You know, to go on Jim's point about old philosophers who have been dead for a couple thousand years. I remember being an undergrad and sitting in those philosophy classes just like you guys did, and yeah, I was. It was one of Aristotle's books, and just to make it very simple and sweet, he said a friendship is a mutually beneficial relationship between both parties. They both benefit from friendship.
Mm-hmm.
Leadership is no different. Leaders
Mm-hmm.
have to benefit off of their employees, and the employees need to benefit off their leaders. It needs to be a mutually beneficial relationship and transaction, right? So that the leader is working for his employees and the employees are working for the leader, right? Both parties need to be in agreement that when they go to work every day, it's because they're doing it to help not just themselves, right? But like I alluded to earlier, to help one another.
That's great. So I think it's a good time to kind of start wrapping it up. And how I like to wrap it up is just for each of you to share kind of your parting thoughts after this discussion, what kind of emerged for you. So I'll start with Jim.
Well, first of all, I have to applaud Gabe. I mean, anybody who's able to cite the Aristotelian Nicomachean ethics and link that to Aristotle's politics, I'm like, wow, I'm good. I raise a glass and a toast to you. That's excellent.
Thank you.
So, and really, it brought a huge smile to my face. That was wonderful. So again, let me sort of wrap it up in things that are germane to my professional sandbox,
Yep.
brain scientist. And I think that one of the things we're going to be seeing is there's going to be increasing reliance on not only the brain sciences and cognitive sciences, but upon the sciences, the physiological sciences writ large. How can we engage human performance in those ways that are going to optimize not only leadership, but task performance across the board? Leaders and those they lead, those who follow, those who seek to lead. And I think increasingly there is going to be this reliance on specializational fields like Gabe's with regard to metabolic science and in biomedical science and what I do in neurocognitive sciences. But I think what is ultimately important to understand is that not to take a materialistically reductive approach to doing that. It's easy. Take a pill, brain machine facing, and we could have an entire conversation on gut brain interactions and what kind of things individuals can do metabolically to enhance their performance capability and what kind of nifty tools we have in the brain sciences. But at the end of the day, I think it becomes important to recognize that science, irrespective of whatever that science it is, whether it's economics, whether it's business science, physiology, is a human endeavor for human endeavor. And regrounding those human endeavors in the humanity of what that is, so that leaders remain leaders of other humans who are equally sensitive and responsive and who may be leaders themselves, becomes, I think, the real opportunity. Yeah, we can harness the sciences in some cool ways. And I'm sure Gabe and I would love to come back and talk about the neat ways that metabolic science and endocrine and paracrine science can.
Oh, yes.
and I can wax sentimental on all kinds of nifty things that go bump in your brain to make leaders better. But I think at the end of the day, it's still that level of appreciating our humanness. Gabe, over to you.
Jim, you put it so eloquently. Really, I raise my glass to you. You brought me a smile to my face when you were correlating all these systems. Brilliant. And it's for me, And again, from my limited perspective of metabolism and immunology and biochemistry, yes, while we can all pop a pill and become quote unquote better versions of ourselves, it's more than that, right? It's our humanity. Who are we as humans? And who we are as humans is fundamental to how we progress forward, right? If we forget that we are people and that we work for people and that the work we do is to help other people, right? Human endeavors for human endeavor. I'm not a believer of altruism for altruism's sake, right? Altruism has to benefit somebody, and I would like it if altruism benefited both parties, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where we got to go in the next, I would say, probably 25 to 50 years. It's going back to this notion of let's collaborate, let's work together so we can figure this problem out, right? No, there's no need to be in silos. There's no need to ignore one another. There's no need to downplay the other person's input, but rather instead take it and say, okay, they provide a very different perspective than what I would have gone with, but you know what, we can use that to our benefit, we can use that to our advantage, and we can play to its strengths, right? And it's that identification of strengths and weaknesses as humans that is what's going to really move leaders forward in the next generations to come.
That's great. Final question that I like to ask each guest, this is a little difficult one, is what is one word, if you were to kind of leave a future intelligent leader, one word, what would that word be? And I'll start with Jim.
Phronesis.
Phronesis.
Yeah, we were talking about Aristotle. I'm gonna end with the good old Aristotle. Phronesis, practical wisdom.
Mm.
It's what Aquinas referred to as prudence, the idea of wisdom in practice that has to be sensitive to the bottom-up effect to be able to then lead wisely top-down.
That's a great word. Thanks,
wow,
Jim.
Jim, that's definitely great. I won't be able to match that one, but I would say it's compassion. It's leaders really need to be equipped with what I like to consider a compassion button, right? And yeah, some people turn it on, some people turn it off, but if we can be compassionate, if we can start to understand each other's humanities and how my actions might affect theirs and vice versa, I think as leaders, that's really what's going to take them forward.
That's great. I think it's a great way to end. My martial arts teacher would always say skill plus wisdom equals compassion. So
yes.
Brilliant.
God, brilliant.
So thank you, Jim and Gabe. Really appreciate your time, your wisdom, your insights today. It's been very, very interesting and very practical and useful information that you shared. I appreciate it. Aloha.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you. It was a pleasure and honor.
No, thank you. Thank you, Tyler, for having me.
Thank you for joining us today on the Flowcast. To get a summary of today's dialogue, find out more about today's guests, listen to previous episodes, or discover more about Haku Global's neuroscience-based Futures Intelligent Leadership programs or customized strategic foresight and innovation sprints, visit us at www.haku.global. At Haku Global, we believe it is time for more futures intelligent leadership. The future is something we need to think more intelligently and feel more deeply about, so we can collaborate to discover today's solutions for future problems. If you are in a leadership role and need support or training to scale futures intelligence across your organization, then contact us at Haku Global. This is your host, Tyler Mongan, and until next time, have a preferred and conscious future. Aloha.